Well, sport is, as we know, one of the great unifiers. Last night, all Australians came together to support the Matildas in Brisbane, wherever they were. Even politics was put to one side. Joining me here in the studio is Paul Fletcher, Manager of Opposition Business in the House of Representatives. No left, no right last night.
That's right. I think all Australians were behind the Matildas and so proud of that extraordinary result. That penalty shootout was agonising but also exhilarating. And I have to say, Mackenzie Arnold is the keeper. Amazing job. A long time ago, I was a goalkeeper for a while, right at the other end of the ability spectrum, I might say, from Mackenzie Arnold. But I don't think goalkeepers get the recognition they deserve. But my word, she really played a critical role last night. Courtney Vine, of course, scoring that winning penalty goal. But what a thing for Australians to all be proud of. And now, of course, we're all behind them for the next step.
Oh, absolutely. Look, there's plenty of things that can divide us here in this country, all around the world, and plenty of things that divide the people in Canberra. But this was one night which I found, being a sports reporter for over 30 years, I can see how sport has been an amazing unifier.
Look, I think it's Australia at its best, and we should also acknowledge New Zealand as the other co-host of this Women's World Cup. But I think around the world, people will have seen Australians love their sport, but Australians have also made teams from so many countries very welcome. And I think the other thing that is really worth celebrating here is that the excellence of elite women's sport is getting the recognition it properly deserves. And I think the way that all Australians have got behind this event is, I think, a strong signal that we all recognise that elite sport, whether it's women's or men's, it deserves the same respect.
Oh, absolutely, and the anticipation for Wednesday night. Well, we need to move away from this, as much as I don't want to, onto other issues. And look, Mark Speakman, the leader of the Liberal Party, the opposition in New South Wales, has come out yesterday and said that he will vote yes in the referendum. This is a blow to Peter Dutton.
Oh, look, I don't think I'd characterise it that way. Obviously, Mark's a very respected figure, leader of the opposition in New South Wales. At the same time, of course, Libby Mettam, the WA opposition leader, has said, in fact, that although she was previously considering supporting the yes case, she's now concluded she'll support the no case. But ultimately, it's a decision for every Australian. There's a referendum coming up, and what the federal opposition is focused on doing under Peter Dutton's leadership is seeking as much information as we can through question time and the other processes of the Parliament. It's very important that Australians have the information they need, because now it's a decision for every Australian in this referendum. You know, earlier in the year, the government was suggesting that they would not have pamphlets with the yes case and the no case going out to every household in the country. That's been the requirement in every referendum for a very long time. We said, look, that's unacceptable. It's important that Australians are well informed, and I'm pleased to say the government ultimately backed down, took the position we recommended, and we've been using question time over the last couple of weeks to seek more information about how the Voice will operate, but also about what happens next. Mr Albanese, Labor have said they're committed to implementing all the elements of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and that also includes the Makarrata Commission, a treaty, a truth-telling process. We've been asking questions about what that might involve. The important thing is that Australians have the information they need when they come to cast their votes.
All right, changing subjects, the tension with China is easing. How important is this relationship?
Well, of course, China is our most important economic relationship, a very major destination for our exports, coal, iron ore, and of course exports like barley, where China effectively closed the door for a couple of years. Similarly, wine, similarly, lobster. Now, that was an attempt by the Chinese government to put pressure on Australia. That was under the Morrison government. We resisted that pressure. Of course, we want a mutually respectful relationship with China, but at the same time recognising some differences in values. We've got different systems. What I think is notable is that essentially the current government, the current Labor government, has broadly maintained the direction that the Morrison government was pursuing. They've maintained, for example, and we commend them for this.
They have improved it a bit though, haven't they?
Well, the point I make is that on the Australian side, it's been about consistency, and that's very important. So, for example, the Albanese government has maintained the AUKUS agreement, the proposal or the plan for Australia to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. Now, that arrangement was entered into by the Morrison government. The Albanese government has maintained that. And certainly We welcome that, the opposition welcomes that. But the point I make is more broadly, essentially we've seen a consistency of direction from the Australian government, even as the governing party has changed. And I think you've seen from both parties a position that we want a mutually respectful relationship with China, but there will be issues on which we disagree. It's in the interest of both nations that there be trade between us, and we have welcomed the fact that China has now said that the barley trade will resume, and we would like to see the exports of wine resume, exports of lobster and other products where those have been subject to restrictions on the Chinese side over the last few years.
We've seen Chen Lei incarcerated in China for 3 years now. Anthony Albanese has been talking about a trip to Beijing. Whether or not that happens in the foreseeable future or not, well, we don't know. But he was asked, will this stop you from going unless something happens here? And he says, well, we can't make our relationship with China transactional. What do you think of that?
Clearly, the notion that somebody is imprisoned without due process, without a fair trial, without the right to defend herself, those are all things which in the Australian system we take for granted, the presumption of innocence, the right to a fair trial. That is a good example of some of the differences between China and Australia. At the same time, it is important that we maintain a continuing relationship. And these are always matters for judgment as to how issues where there is a difference of opinion are to be pursued. And it is an ongoing relationship. It needs to be managed in Australia's national interest, and that is important but challenging, whichever party is in power. 60
days dispensing changes for pharmacies. Big medical discussions in Parliament, of course, around pricing. There is huge cost of living pressures. Your thoughts?
Well, we've been clear that we support cheaper medicines for Australians. The concern that we have, and this came to a head really in this last week in Parliament, the concern that we have is the lack of adequate consultation between the Health Minister, Mark Butler, and pharmacies. This will have a significant impact on the financial viability of pharmacies. The hit to pharmacies in dollar terms is significant. Now, at the same time, of course, we want to see Australians getting cheaper medicines. But the issue we've been pursuing is, well, what happens if this leads to pharmacies, particularly in regional and remote areas, but potentially in metropolitan areas as well, having their viability threatened such that they no longer operate? It is not of much benefit to Australians to say, well, you can get cheaper medicines, but you don't have a pharmacy to be able to go to, particularly, for example, in a regional town, to get your medicines. And we have been pressing the government to have a more appropriate process in the way that it engages with pharmacies on this matter. And that was the focus certainly of our disallowance motion in the Senate last week. And so we do continue to call on the government to engage with the pharmacy sector on this matter. And that's been our consistent message.
Finally, looking overseas, and it's a bit of a question without notice, but we discussed it this morning with a legal expert in the US. You're a very learned individual, you're ducks in your school, studied, but also a keen, a keen viewer of what happens internationally. Do you find what's happening in the United States in and around Donald Trump, all the legal issues and still being the lead candidate in the Republican Party to have the candidacy for the next election, astonishing?
The United States is an extraordinary nation. I had the chance to live there for a couple of years when I was doing a master's degree at Columbia in New York. It is a very big place. It's a very diverse place. In one part of the country, you can feel it's very different from another part of the country. It's also a country that has optional voting rather than compulsory voting, and that tends to cause both major parties to have more of a focus on, rather than going to the centre, seeking to engage their base to come out and vote. So that can produce some different behaviours in the political system. At the same time, what I'd say is, the United States has been a robust and vigorous democracy for a long time. It's gone through some very testing times. There was a civil war, of course, second half of the 19th century.
I don't think we've seen a political scene quite like it since the Civil War.
Well, the point I make is, yes, the United States system is under strain at the moment, but it's also proven to be a very resilient system over more than 2 centuries. It's certainly in Australia's interest that the United States gets through the current challenges, and that balance between the political process and judicial processes, criminal investigations and so on, is always one that needs to be navigated carefully. So I would simply say it's in our interest that the great strength and flexibility of the United States system, which has overcome big challenges before, is able to overcome these challenges now.
There's certainly challenges, that's for sure. It's going to be an interesting 12 months. Let's finish on a bright note. How many do we beat England by on Wednesday?
Well, let's not put any kind of hex on the Matildas. They've done such a fabulous job, and I'm sure their coach will be working with them very closely on the right mental attitudes. They've shown such great mental strength in getting through. I mean, I was at our local live site at St Ives Village Green watching the loss to Nigeria. So to bounce back from that, of course, has been important. I'm sure they will be focused, and they'll bring their mental strength as well as superb physical attributes to that game.
Oh yeah, fingers crossed. And I think the TV ratings, I reckon they'll be the greatest we've ever seen on Wednesday night. I really do. Mr. Fletcher, always good to talk.
Thanks.